I was 28 when I told my family I was going to buy the house we grew up in. The same Victorian two-story with the creaky porch steps and the kitchen window that never quite closed all the way. The same house where my grandmother had raised 3 generations of stubborn, complicated people who somehow forgot how to love each other properly along the way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They laughed. Not the warm, encouraging kind of laughter that says, "Dream big, sweetheart." This was the sharp, dismissive kind that cuts through your confidence like a blade through paper. My mother actually snorted, covering her mouth with her hand as if that made it more polite. My older brother Marcus leaned back in his chair and shook his head like I just announced I was planning to fly to the moon using kitchen utensils. My younger sister Carmen rolled her eyes so hard I'm surprised they didn't fall out of her head entirely. "With what money, Celeste?" my mother asked, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension I'd grown up swallowing like bitter medicine. "You work at that little coffee shop, making what, minimum wage? And you think you can afford a house that's worth $300,000? The foreclosure notice would arrive exactly 18 months later. But that day, sitting in our family dining room with the afternoon sun streaming through those familiar windows, I had no idea that their laughter would be the last sound I'd hear from them that felt anything like a family gathering. I had no idea that their mockery would become the fuel that powered every decision I made after that moment. My name is Celeste Rivera, and I learned early that being the middle child in a family of high achievers means you become invisible in the most painful way possible. Not ignored exactly, but overlooked. Like a piece of furniture that's functional, but not worth noticing. Marcus was the golden boy. The one who got into law school, who made partner at 29, who could do no wrong even when he was doing everything wrong. Carmen was the baby, the creative one, the free spirit who everyone indulged because she was finding herself at 24 while living rent-free in the basement. And me? I was the dependable one, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, who organized family gatherings, who showed up when someone needed help moving or a ride to the airport or someone to listen while they complained about their problems for hours on end. I was the glue that held our family together, though I didn't realize then that glue is only noticed when it stops working. Growing up in that house on Maple Street, I watched my siblings get celebrated for everything, while I got acknowledged for nothing. When Marcus scored his first touchdown in high school, Dad threw him a party. When Carmen got into art school, Mom cried happy tears and hung her acceptance letter on the refrigerator for 6 months. When I graduated valedictorian from high school, I got a pat on the head and, "We always knew you were smart, mija." No party, no tears, no letter on the fridge. Just an assumption that my success was inevitable, unremarkable, expected. The house itself had always been more than just a building to me. It was where Abuela had taught me to make empanadas, where I'd spent countless hours reading in the window seat of my tiny bedroom, where I dreamed of becoming a writer someday. Every room held memories that my siblings seemed to take for granted, but that I treasured like sacred things. The way the morning light hit the kitchen table just right, the sound of rain on the attic roof, the smell of jasmine that drifted in through the living room windows every spring. My parents bought the house in 1985, right after they got married, when property in our neighborhood was still affordable for a young teacher and a mechanic. Over the years, as the area gentrified around us, that house became worth more than they'd ever imagined. It also became the source of their identity, their pride, their constant topic of conversation. They loved to tell people about their investment, about how smart they'd been to buy when they did, about how much equity they'd built up. What they didn't love to talk about was how they'd refinanced it 4 times to pay for Marcus's law school, Carmen's art supplies and student loans, and their own increasingly expensive lifestyle. They'd pulled equity out of that house like it was an ATM, always confident that the value would keep rising, always sure that they'd figure out a way to manage the payments. I started working at Grind Coffee when I was 22, right after I graduated from community college with an associate's degree in business administration. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved it. I loved learning about different coffee beans, perfecting latte art, and getting to know our regular customers by name and order. The owner, Mrs. Chen, saw something in me that my family never did, and within 2 years, she'd promoted me to assistant manager. By 26, I was managing the entire operation, handling scheduling, inventory, customer service, and training new employees. Mrs. Chen paid me well for a coffee shop, especially after I implemented new systems that increased our efficiency and customer satisfaction scores. But well, in coffee shop terms, still meant I was making $32,000 a year, living in a studio apartment above a laundromat, and driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic that required prayer and mechanical intervention in equal measure. Still, I saved money. Not a lot, but consistently. $50 a month at first, then $100, then whatever I could manage after my bills were paid. I had a dream, and that dream lived in a savings account that grew slowly but steadily, like a plant in a window that gets just enough light to survive. The dream was simple. I wanted to buy a house. Not just any house, but the house. Our house. The one where I'd grown up, where Abuela's spirit still seemed to linger in the kitchen, where my childhood lived in every corner and crevice. I knew it was ambitious, maybe even foolish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house belonged to me in a way that it didn't belong to anyone else in my family. When I was 27, Mrs. Chen offered to sell me the coffee shop. She was getting older, wanted to retire and spend time with her grandchildren, and she said I was the only person she trusted to maintain the quality and community spirit we'd built together. The price was fair, the terms generous, and she was willing to finance it herself to avoid bank complications. It would mean taking on debt, but it would also mean owning something, building something, having a real career instead of just a job. I spent weeks thinking about it, running numbers, imagining different scenarios. I even drove by the house a few times, looking up at the windows of my old bedroom, wondering what it would be like to live there again as an adult, as an owner instead of just a daughter. That's when I started researching property values in our neighborhood, looking at recent sales, understanding what houses like ours were actually selling for. The numbers were higher than I had expected, but not impossibly so. With the coffee shop income, plus what I'd saved, plus a reasonable mortgage, it could work. It would be tight, it would require sacrifice, but it could work. I could buy grind coffee for Mrs. Chen, increase my income significantly, save more aggressively, and within 2 or 3 years, make an offer on the house that had shaped my entire life. The more I thought about it, the more right it felt. My siblings had moved away, built their own lives, shown no particular attachment to the house beyond nostalgia. Marcus lived in a downtown loft that cost more per month than I made in 3 months, completely focused on his legal career and his string of girlfriends who all looked exactly the same. Carmen flitted between cities and boyfriends and artistic phases, using the house as a landing pad whenever her current adventure fell apart. But me? I was rooted there. My life, my work, my friends, my entire support system existed within a 5-mile radius of that house. It made sense for me to own it, to preserve it, to fill it with the kind of love and attention it deserved. So I decided to tell my family about my plan, not to ask for permission or approval, but to share my excitement, to let them know that someone in the family was prepared to keep the house in the Rivera name for another generation. I thought they'd be proud of my ambition, impressed by my planning, maybe even grateful that I cared enough to make such a significant commitment. I was wrong about all of that. I chose Sunday dinner to make my announcement, the same Sunday dinner tradition I'd been organizing and hosting for the past 3 years. I cooked, I cleaned, I set the table, I made sure there was food everyone would enjoy. It was my attempt to recreate the family dinners Abuela used to insist on, back when we actually felt like a family instead of just people who happened to share DNA. Marcus showed up 20 minutes late, as usual, complaining about traffic and work stress. Carmen arrived with paint under her fingernails and attitude in her voice, making sure everyone knew she was sacrificing precious creative time to be there. Mom and Dad came bearing complaints about their neighbors, their coworkers, their various minor health issues, and the general state of the world. I served everyone their plates, made sure their glasses were full, asked about their weeks, and listened to their stories with the same patient attention I'd been providing for years. Then, when there was a natural lull in the conversation, I took a deep breath and shared my news. "I have something exciting to tell you all," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and confident. "I'm going to buy this house." The silence that followed felt like a held breath, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then, Marcus started chuckling, a low sound that built into full laughter. Carmen joined in, her laugh higher and sharper, more cutting. Mom's snort came next, followed by Dad's head shake and bemused smile. "Buy this house?" Marcus repeated, like he was making sure he'd heard correctly. "This house? Our house?" "With what money, Celeste?" Mom asked, and there was no warmth in her voice, no curiosity about my plan, just immediate dismissal. "You work at that little coffee shop, making what, minimum wage? And you think you can afford a house that's worth $300,000? "Actually," I started, trying to explain about Mrs. Chen's offer, about my business plan, about the research I'd done, but Dad cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Mija, be realistic," he said, using the same tone he'd used when I was 8 and announced I wanted to be a mermaid when I grew up. "Owning a house is serious business. There's insurance and property taxes and maintenance costs. It's not like paying rent. You can't just decide you want something and make it happen because you want it." "I know that," I said, my voice smaller now, the confidence leaking out of me like air from a punctured balloon. "I've done research, I have a plan. Mrs. Chen is selling me the coffee shop, which will increase my income significantly, and I've been saving—" "A coffee shop," Carmen interrupted, her voice dripping with the same disdain she used when talking about anything she considered beneath her artistic sensibilities. "You're going to base your entire financial future on a coffee shop in a strip mall?" "It's a good business," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "We have loyal customers, consistent profits, room for growth. And it's not just about the coffee shop. I've looked at mortgage options, calculated my debt-to-income ratio, projected my savings over the next few years." "Celeste," Mom said, reaching over to pat my hand in a way that felt patronizing rather than comforting, "it's sweet that you've been thinking about this, but buying a house is complicated. There are so many things you probably haven't considered. What if the coffee shop fails? What if you get sick and can't work? What if the neighborhood changes and property values drop?" Marcus leaned forward, putting on his lawyer voice, the one he used when he wanted to sound authoritative and wise. "Look, sis, I appreciate the ambition, I really do, but homeownership is a huge responsibility, and it requires a certain level of financial stability that, frankly, you haven't demonstrated yet. You're 28, you've never owned anything more valuable than that car you drive, and you want to take on a $300,000 debt. That's not realistic. That's reckless." The words hit me like physical blows, each one finding the soft spots in my confidence, the places where doubt lived, even when I tried to push it away. They weren't asking about my plan, weren't interested in the research I'd done or the preparation I'd put in. They'd already decided I wasn't capable, wasn't worthy, wasn't serious enough to be taken seriously. "Besides," Carmen added, picking at her food with the kind of bored disinterest she'd perfected since middle school, "what would you even do with this big house? You don't have a boyfriend, you don't have kids, you barely have friends over. It would just be you rattling around in all these rooms by yourself, playing house with Abuela's furniture." That last comment cut deeper than the rest because it was the closest to true. I didn't have a boyfriend, didn't have kids, spent most of my free time reading or working on small writing projects I never showed anyone. But the idea that I didn't deserve space, didn't deserve to dream bigger than my current circumstances, didn't deserve to want something beautiful and meaningful just because I was single, felt like a betrayal of everything I thought family was supposed to be. "I love this house," I said quietly, looking around the dining room where we'd shared so many meals, where Abuela had taught me to set a proper table, where I'd done homework while she cooked dinner and told me stories about our ancestors. "I love this house, and I think I could take good care of it." "Loving something doesn't mean you can afford it," Dad said, his voice gentler than the others, but somehow more final. Love doesn't pay mortgages, mija. Love doesn't fix broken pipes or replace worn-out roofs. You need to be practical. The conversation moved on after that, shifting to Marcus's latest case, Carmen's newest art project, Mom's workplace drama. But I sat there in silence, pushing food around my plate, feeling like I'd been shrunk down to child size again, like I was 8 years old being told my dreams were too big, too impractical, too much for someone like me to handle. I finished cleaning up after dinner alone, as usual. Everyone else had places to be, things to do, lives to return to that didn't include helping the person who organized and hosted and cooked for them. As I washed dishes and put away leftovers, I could hear the echoes of their laughter, the sound of my family dismissing the biggest dream I'd ever shared with them. That night, I lay in my studio apartment staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every laugh, every dismissive comment. Part of me wanted to abandon the whole idea, to accept that maybe they were right, maybe I was being unrealistic, maybe I should stick to what was safe and known and expected of someone in my position. But there was another part of me, smaller but stronger, that was angry. Not just hurt, but genuinely angry at the way they'd treated my dream like a joke, my planning like childish fantasy, my love for our family home like something embarrassing and naive. That anger felt clean and clarifying, like a flame burning away everything that wasn't essential. I got up and opened my laptop, pulling up the business plan I'd been working on for months. I read through every projection, every calculation, every carefully researched detail. Then I opened a new document and started writing a timeline, breaking down exactly what I needed to do and when I needed to do it to make this dream a reality. If my family wouldn't support me, I'd support myself. If they wouldn't believe in me, I'd believe in myself enough for us all. And when I owned that house, when I was making mortgage payments and fixing broken pipes and replacing worn-out roofs, maybe then they'd understand that love actually can move mountains, especially when it's backed up by determination, planning, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from being underestimated your entire life. 2 days later, I signed the papers to buy grind coffee from Mrs. Chen. The ink was barely dry when I called my real estate agent and told her I was ready to start looking at financing options seriously. She was encouraging, professional, and, most importantly, she didn't laugh when I told her what I wanted to do. "It's ambitious," she said, "but not impossible. Let's run some numbers and see what we can make work." Those words felt like the first real support I'd gotten from anyone, and they gave me the energy to keep moving forward. I threw myself into running the coffee shop with renewed purpose, implementing new systems, expanding our menu, building relationships with local suppliers, and focusing on customer service in a way that started generating buzz in our community. Within 6 months, our revenue had increased by 20%. Within a year, we become the go-to spot for local business meetings, study groups, and casual dates. I was working 60-hour weeks, but every dollar that went into my bank account felt like progress towards something that mattered. I didn't tell my family about any of this. They'd made it clear that my business ventures and home ownership dreams weren't worth their attention, so I stopped sharing updates about my life with them. When they asked how work was going, I said, "Fine," and changed the subject. When they wondered why I seemed distant during family gatherings, I smiled and said I was just tired. The truth was, I was too busy building my future to explain it to people who'd already decided it wasn't possible. I was learning that sometimes the best response to being underestimated is simply to prove everyone wrong quietly, consistently, and without asking for permission or forgiveness. 18 months after that Sunday dinner, I had enough saved for a down payment. My credit score was excellent, my business was thriving, and my real estate agent had pre-approved me for a mortgage that would cover the house on Maple Street if it ever went on the market. That's when I got the call from Carmen. She was crying, which was unusual for her because Carmen typically expressed distress through dramatic declarations rather than actual tears. "Celeste," she sobbed into the phone, "something terrible has happened. Mom and Dad are losing the house."
The foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday morning, Carmen told me through her tears, mixed in with the usual stack of bills and grocery store circulars. Mom had opened it thinking it was some kind of scam, one of those fake legal documents that companies sent to scare people into paying debts that they don't actually owe. It took her 3 readings to understand that it was real, that they had 60 days to bring their mortgage current or lose the house they'd lived in for nearly 40 years. The amount they owed was staggering, not just the missed payments, which had been accumulating for 8 months, but the fees, the penalties, the interest on the interest. Dad had been out of work for 6 months after his back surgery, and Mom's teaching salary had never been enough to cover their expenses even when times were good. They'd been juggling credit cards, borrowing from retirement accounts, and making partial mortgage payments, always believing that Dad would find another job, that their situation would improve, that somehow they'd find a way to catch up. They hadn't told any of us how bad things had gotten. Pride, Carmen said, though I suspected it was more than that. They'd spent so many years talking about their house like it was their greatest achievement, their smartest investment, their ticket to financial security. Admitting they were about to lose it would have meant admitting they'd made mistakes, that their financial wisdom wasn't as solid as they'd pretended, that they were as vulnerable as anyone else. Carmen had driven over as soon as she got the call, finding Mom sitting at the kitchen table with the notice spread out in front of her like evidence of some terrible crime. Dad was in his workshop, she said, just sitting there, staring at his tools, not building anything, not fixing anything, just sitting in the silence of a man who'd run out of solutions. "They need help," Carmen said, her voice thick with tears and desperation. "We need to figure out how to help them. Can Marcus take out a loan? Can we all pool our money together? There has to be something we can do." I sat in my office above the coffee shop, looking down at the afternoon crowd of customers who had no idea that my world had just shifted on its axis. The irony was so thick I could taste it, metallic and bitter, like blood in my mouth. 18 months ago, I'd sat at that same kitchen table and told them I wanted to buy their house, and they'd laughed at me like I'd suggested swimming to the moon. Now they were going to lose it, and suddenly everyone was expected to care, to help, to find solutions. "How much do they owe?" I asked, though I was already calculating numbers in my head, already understanding what the answer would mean. $47,000, Carmen whispered. $47,000 to bring everything current and stop the foreclosure. Plus, they'd need to figure out how to make the regular payments going forward, but if we could just get them caught up, maybe Dad could find work. Maybe they could sell the house properly instead of losing it to the bank. $47,000. I had that much in my savings account. The money I'd been accumulating for my down payment. My dream fund, my ticket to owning the house that was about to slip through all of our fingers. I could write a check that afternoon and solve their immediate problem, could save the house that had raised me, could be the hero my family had never expected me to be. But something held me back from offering immediately, some instinct for self-preservation that had been growing stronger over the past 18 months of being excluded from their lives. I thought about all the Sunday dinners where they'd discuss their financial stress without mentioning how serious it was. All the times they'd complained about money troubles while still managing to pay for Marcus's expensive dinners and Carmen's art supplies and their own small luxuries. "Have you talked to Marcus? He makes more money than all of us. And what about all that equity they used to brag about? Can't they get another loan against the house?" Carmen's laugh was bitter, empty of any real humor. "Marcus says his money is tied up in investments and his condo payment. He offered to ask his girlfriend's father about legal options, but he can't just write a check for $47,000. And the equity is gone, Celeste. They've refinanced so many times, borrowed against it so often, that they actually owe more than the house is worth right now. The market hasn't been good to this neighborhood." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a recognition that the house I dreamed of owning might not even be worth what I thought it was worth. If my parents owed more than its current value, if the neighborhood had declined enough to affect property prices, then maybe my family's laughter had been justified all along. Maybe I've been chasing a dream that was worth less than I'd believed. But that coldness was quickly replaced by something hotter, more familiar. Anger at being kept in the dark about something that affected all of us. Anger at Marcus for having an excuse ready, at Carmen for calling me only when she needed something, at my parents for letting their pride prevent them from asking for help until it was almost too late. "What do they want from me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They want to know if you can help," Carmen said carefully. "I know you don't make as much as Marcus, but you're good with money, you save more than the rest of us, and you've always loved that house more than anyone. I thought maybe you'd want to help save it." There it was, the assumption that my love for the house would override everything, that my emotional attachment would make me willing to sacrifice my own financial security to solve a problem I hadn't created. The same love they'd dismissed as naive and impractical was suddenly valuable to them, useful, worth exploiting. "I need to think about it," I said, which was true, though I'd already started thinking and the direction of my thoughts would have surprised Carmen if she could have seen them. "Can you think fast?" Carmen asked, urgency creeping into her voice. "We only have 60 days, and these things move quickly once they start. If we're going to help them, we need to act soon." After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the shadows grow longer as the afternoon faded into evening.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Downstairs, my employees were handling the dinner rush. The familiar sounds of the espresso machine and customer conversations drifting up through the floor. This business, this life I'd built, this independence I'd earned, all of it felt suddenly fragile, threatened by the gravitational pull of my family's crisis. I opened my laptop and started researching foreclosure processes, trying to understand exactly what my parents were facing, what their options were, what would happen if they couldn't come up with the money. The information I found was sobering. Foreclosure wasn't just about losing the house. It would destroy their credit, make it nearly impossible for them to qualify for another mortgage or even rent a decent apartment. At their age, with dad's health issues and mom's modest income, they could end up in a very precarious situation. But I also found information about foreclosure auctions, about how properties were priced and sold when banks needed to recover their losses quickly. Houses in foreclosure often sold for significantly less than their market value, sometimes for just enough to cover the outstanding mortgage debt, sometimes for even less than that. An idea began forming in my mind, cold and calculating and completely unlike anything I'd ever considered before. It was the kind of idea that would have horrified me 18 months earlier, when I still believed that family loyalty meant sacrificing your own interests for the good of the group. But 18 months of being excluded, dismissed, and underestimated had changed something fundamental in me. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could about real estate options, foreclosure procedures, and property values in our neighborhood. I drove past the house twice, looking at it with new eyes, trying to see it not as the repository of my childhood memories, but as a potential investment opportunity. The exterior needed work, the roof would probably need replacing within a few years, and the kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1990s. But the bones were solid, the lot was a good size, and the location was still desirable despite the recent market fluctuations. More importantly, I discovered that the house was actually worth more than Carmen had suggested. The market had been soft, but not devastated, and comparable properties in the neighborhood were selling for amounts that would make my original plan viable, assuming I could acquire the house at the right price. I also learned that family members couldn't bid on foreclosed properties if they'd been living in the house or had financial relationships with the owners. But I'd been living independently for years, had no formal financial ties to my parents' mortgage, and had never been listed as a resident of the property. Legally, I would be eligible to bid at the auction just like any other potential buyer. The plan that emerged from my research was audacious, potentially cruel, and absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. I wouldn't give my parents $47,000 to save the house. Instead, I would let the foreclosure proceed, then buy the house myself at auction, likely for significantly less than its actual market value.
I would get my childhood home at a discount, and my parents would learn what it felt like to have their dreams dismissed by someone who supposedly loved them. The cruelty of it took my breath away. The justice of it made my heart race. On Thursday evening, I called Carmen back. "I can't do it," I told her, putting just the right amount of regret in my voice. "I've looked at my finances and I don't have $47,000 to spare. The coffee shop is doing well, but I've got business loans to service, equipment to replace, and I need to maintain my emergency fund. I'm sorry, but I can't risk my business to save the house." It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have business expenses, and I did need to maintain some emergency reserves. But the truth was that I had enough money to help them and still maintain my financial stability. I was choosing not to help them, and the choice felt both terrifying and liberating. Carmen was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure?" she asked finally. "I know it's a lot of money, but this is our family home. This is where we grew up. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Of course it means something to me," I said, letting some real emotion creep into my voice. "It means everything to me, but I can't bankrupt myself to save it. I'm not Marcus, Carmen. I don't have unlimited resources. I've worked incredibly hard to build financial stability, and I can't throw that away, even for the house." "I understand," Carmen said, though her tone suggested she didn't understand at all, that she was disappointed in me in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "I'll keep trying to figure something out. Maybe Marcus can liquidate some of his investments, or maybe we can find a way to refinance, or maybe there's some kind of assistance program." After we hung up, I felt hollowed out, like I'd scooped something essential from my chest and thrown it away. The version of myself who would have immediately offered to help, who would have sacrificed my own security without question, felt like a stranger I'd once known but could no longer access. In her place was someone harder, more calculating, someone who understood that love without respect was just exploitation wearing a prettier name. I spent the next 3 days writing. Not the cheerful social media posts for the coffee shop, not business correspondence, but raw, honest writing about what it felt like to be the invisible child in a family that only saw you when they needed something. I wrote about the Sunday dinners where I'd cooked and cleaned and listened and been forgotten. I wrote about the laughter that had greeted my dreams, the assumption that I was too small and too simple to want anything significant. I wrote about the phone call that expected me to save the day after I'd been excluded from the story entirely. The writing helped clarify something that had been building in me for months. I wasn't angry just about the house, or the money, or even the dismissive laughter. I was angry about being treated like a supporting character in my own family, like someone who existed to serve other people's needs without having any legitimate needs of my own. By Sunday night, I'd made my decision completely. I wouldn't save the house by giving my parents $47,000. Instead, I would buy it myself when it went to auction, probably for $30,000 or $35,000 if the foreclosure proceeded on schedule. I would get my childhood home at a significant discount, and my parents would learn what it felt like to have their dreams dismissed by someone who supposedly loved them. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for a Thursday morning in 6 weeks. I spent those weeks preparing meticulously, researching the bidding process, arranging financing, and driving by the house regularly to assess its condition and potential. I also spent time mentally preparing myself for what would happen after the auction, for the conversations I would have to have with my family, for the accusations and anger they would try to use against me. I told no one about my plan, not Mrs. Chen, who had become something like a mentor to me, not my real estate agent, who would have been professionally obligated to discourage me from bidding against my own family, not even my therapist, who I'd started seeing after the coffee shop purchase to help me navigate the stress of small business ownership. This plan felt too fragile, too morally complicated, and too personally significant to share with anyone who might try to talk me out of it. 3 weeks before the auction, Marcus called me directly for the first time in over a year. "Carmen says you can't help with the house situation," he said without prelude, his lawyer voice in full effect. "That's right," I replied, matching his business-like tone. "I don't have that kind of liquid capital available." "But you're doing well with the coffee shop, right? Carmen mentioned you bought it from the previous owner." That suggests you have access to credit, maybe business loans you could leverage? I almost laughed at the transparency of it. Marcus, who makes 3 times my annual income, who lives in a luxury condo and drives a car that costs more than I paid for my business, was trying to convince me to take on debt to solve a problem he could afford to solve himself. I'm not going to leverage my business to pay off someone else's mortgage. That would be financially irresponsible.
I'm sure you understand. This isn't someone else's mortgage, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. These are our parents. This is our family home. Sometimes financial responsibility means making sacrifices for the people you love. Does it? I asked. Because you're not making that sacrifice. Carmen's not making that sacrifice. Why is financial responsibility specifically my burden in this situation? Marcus was quiet for a moment, probably trying to formulate an argument that would sound reasonable rather than desperate. Look, Celeste, I know we haven't always appreciated everything you do for the family. Maybe we've taken you for granted sometimes. But this is bigger than any past disagreements. This is about keeping our family together, keeping our history intact. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever gotten from Marcus, and it might have meant something if it hadn't come attached to a request for tens of thousands of dollars. The fact that he could acknowledge taking me for granted while simultaneously trying to take advantage of me again would have been impressive if it weren't so predictable. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it, though probably not in the way he hoped. I can't help with this. I hope you figure something out. 2 weeks before the auction, Dad called me. His voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the confidence that had always defined him in my mind. Mija, he said, and I could hear him struggling with the words, your mother and I are in trouble. Real trouble. We're going to lose the house. I know, I said gently. Carmen told me. I'm sorry this is happening. We've been proud people, Dad continued, his voice thick with emotion I wasn't used to hearing from him. Maybe too proud. We should have asked for help sooner, should have told you kids how bad things were getting, but we kept thinking we could handle it ourselves, that we could figure it out. I understand, I said. And I did understand, though understanding didn't change my decision. Carmen says you can't help with the money, and I respect that. I know we haven't always supported your dreams the way we should have. I know we laughed when you said you wanted to buy the house, and that wasn't fair to you. You've worked hard. Build something good for yourself, and you shouldn't have to risk that for our mistakes. The words I'd been waiting to hear for 18 months, and they came now when they could no longer change anything. Dad's acknowledgement of their dismissive treatment, his recognition of my hard work, his admission that they'd made mistakes, all of it arriving precisely when it was too late to matter. I appreciate you saying that, I told him, meaning it completely. But I wanted to ask you something different, Dad said. Would you consider co-signing a loan for us? We found a lender who might work with us if we had a co-signer with good credit. You wouldn't have to pay anything up front, just put your name on the paperwork. If we default, which we won't, you'd be responsible, but we're confident we can make the payments if we can just get caught up. It was a terrible idea financially, the kind of arrangement that destroyed relationships and credit scores with equal efficiency. Even if my parents managed to make their payments, which seemed unlikely given their track record, I would be legally responsible for their debt until it was fully paid off. If they missed payments, my credit would be damaged. If they defaulted entirely, I would owe the full amount plus fees and penalties. More than that, it was insulting in its assumptions. They wanted me to take on all the risk of helping them without giving me any of the benefits of ownership. They wanted my financial stability to backstop their financial instability, but they wanted to keep the house, keep the control, keep the equity if the market improved. I can't do that, Dad, I said firmly. Co-signing loans is almost never a good idea, especially for amounts this large. I'm sorry, but I can't put my financial future at risk like that. Dad sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. I understand, Mija. I had to ask, but I understand. We'll figure something out, somehow. The auction was held on the courthouse steps on a gray Thursday morning in October. I arrived early, dressed in jeans and a sweater, carrying a cashier's check and all the necessary documentation.
There were about a dozen other potential bidders, mostly investors and house flippers, who specialized in distressed properties. I recognized the auctioneer from my research, a thin man with a loud voice who'd been conducting foreclosure sales for over 20 years. He read through the legal description of the property, the terms of the sale, and the minimum bid amount, which was set at $32,000. The bidding started slowly. A few investors made tentative offers, testing the interest level, trying to get a sense of how much competition they were facing. I waited, watching, calculating, trying to determine the right moment to enter the bidding. At $38,000, most of the casual bidders dropped out, leaving 3 serious contenders plus myself. At $42,000, it was down to one persistent investor and me. He was an older man in an expensive suit who kept making small, incremental bids, trying to discourage me from continuing. At $45,000, I made my final bid, an amount that was still significantly less than the house's market value, but high enough to secure it. The investor in the suit considered for a moment, looked at me with something like resignation, and shook his head. "Sold," the auctioneer called out, "to bidder number 7 for $45,000. I owned the house where I grew up, where I dreamed of living as an adult, where my family dismissed my ambitions and laughed at my plans. I'd bought it at a foreclosure auction for $45,000, less than my parents owed on their mortgage, significantly less than its actual market value, and exactly the amount I could afford without compromising my financial stability." The paperwork took 2 hours. I signed documents, wrote checks, and received a deed that made me the legal owner of 847 Maple Street. The whole process felt surreal, like I was watching someone else make these decisions, sign these papers, take possession of this property that represented so much more than just a house. I drove to the house afterwards, using my new key to unlock the front door and step inside. It was empty. My parents had moved out the week before, taking their furniture and belongings to a rental apartment across town. The rooms looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier, more ordinary without the furniture and decorations that had made it feel like home. But standing in the living room where I'd read hundreds of books, looking out the window where I'd watched seasons change for 18 years of my life, I felt something settle into place inside me. This was mine now.
Not through inheritance, not as a gift, not because someone had decided I deserved it, but because I'd worked for it, saved for it, planned for it, and been willing to do what was necessary to get it. I pulled out my phone and called Carmen. "The house sold at auction today," I told her when she answered. "Oh no," Carmen said, her voice heavy with defeat. "How much did it go for? Maybe we can talk to whoever bought it, see if they'd be willing to sell it back to Mom and Dad for what they paid?" "It sold for $45,000, I said, letting the number hang in the air between us. $45,000, Carmen repeated. "That's all? God, if we'd known it would go for so little, maybe we could have found a way to come up with that much. That's so much less than what they owed on it." "I know," I said. "It's a good deal for whoever bought it." "Do you know who the buyer was?" Carmen asked. "Maybe Marcus could reach out through his legal contacts, see if there's any way to work something out." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to say, the bridge I was about to burn, the family dynamic I was about to shatter completely. "I bought it," I said simply. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long, I thought the call might have dropped. Finally, Carmen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you say?" "I said I bought it," I repeated, my voice steady and calm. "I'm the new owner of 847 Maple Street. I bought our childhood home at the foreclosure auction for $45,000. "You bought it?" Carmen's voice was rising now, shock giving way to something that sounded like rage. "You bought our parents' house? Our house? The house you said you couldn't afford to save?" "I couldn't afford to save it. I could afford to buy it. There's a difference." "What kind of difference?" Carmen demanded. "You had money to buy the house, but not money to help Mom and Dad keep the house? That doesn't make any sense, Celeste. That's not how family works." "Isn't it?" I asked. "Because I told you all 18 months ago that I wanted to buy this house, and you laughed at me. You told me I was being unrealistic, that I didn't understand what home ownership meant, that I should be practical instead of dreaming too big. Well,
I was practical. I saved my money, I built my business, I prepared myself financially, and when the opportunity came to buy the house at a price I could afford, I bought it. But Mom and Dad, Carmen stammered, they're homeless now. They're living in some terrible apartment, and Dad's health isn't good, and you could have prevented all of this. I could have delayed it. If I'd given him $47,000, they would have been caught up on their mortgage temporarily. But they still wouldn't have been able to afford the ongoing payments. They still would have been house poor and struggling, and they probably would have fallen behind again within a year or two. This way, at least the house stays in the family. Stays in the family? Carmen's laugh was harsh, bitter. You think what you did keeps the house in the family? You stole it from our parents. You let them lose their home so you could get it cheap. That's not keeping it in the family. That's betraying the family. The accusation hung between us like a physical thing, sharp and ugly and impossible to take back. Carmen had called me a betrayer, a thief who had stolen from our own parents, and part of me wanted to hang up the phone and never speak to any of them again. But a larger part of me felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Finally, someone was saying out loud what we'd all been dancing around for years. Finally, we were having the conversation about what family actually meant and what we owed each other. I didn't steal anything, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. I bought a house at a public auction. The same house that you all told me I was too poor, too inexperienced, and too unrealistic to afford. The same house that none of you wanted to help save when our parents needed $47,000. Now that I own it for $45,000, suddenly everyone cares about keeping it in the family. Carmen's breathing was sharp and irregular, like she was trying to control tears or rage or both. That's not the same thing at all, and you know it. Helping them pay their mortgage and buying their house out from under them are completely different things. Are they? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the result is the same. The house is owned by a Rivera, it's being maintained and cared for by someone who loves it, and it's not going to be torn down or flipped by some investor who doesn't understand its history. The only difference is that now I'm the Rivera who owns it instead of Mom and Dad. The difference, Carmen said, her voice thick with disgust, is that Mom and Dad raised us in that house. They sacrificed for years to buy it and maintain it. They poured their lives into making it a home for our family. And you took advantage of their financial crisis to steal it from them. They didn't sacrifice to maintain it, I shot back, feeling my control slip. They borrowed against it over and over again to pay for things they couldn't afford. They refinanced it to pay for Marcus's law school, for your art supplies, for vacations and cars and whatever else they wanted in the moment. They treated that house like a credit card. And when the bill came due, suddenly it was everyone else's responsibility to bail them out. That's not fair, Carmen protested. They were investing in their children, trying to give us opportunities they never had.
Marcus's law degree benefits the whole family. My education opened doors that wouldn't have existed otherwise. They weren't being selfish. They were being generous. Generous with money they didn't have, I said. Generous with equity that belonged to the house I loved more than anyone else in this family. And when I told you I wanted to buy that house myself, you laughed at me. You told me I was being unrealistic. Well, I was realistic. I saved money while you were spending theirs. I built a business while you were pursuing your art. I prepared for the opportunity while you were all assuming someone else would solve the problem. The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt different. Less shocked, more thoughtful. I could hear Carmen processing what I'd said, trying to find a way to argue with the logic even though the facts were undeniable. So what happens now? She asked finally. You own the house. Mom and Dad are living in some cramped apartment. Are you just going to live there by yourself, surrounded by all our childhood memories, pretending like you didn't destroy our family to get it? I didn't destroy our family, I said quietly. Our family was already broken. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. Within an hour of hanging up with Carmen, my phone started ringing. First Marcus, his voice tight with professional outrage, demanding to know if what Carmen had told him was true. Then Mom, crying and asking how I could do this to them, how I could be so cruel to the people who had loved and supported me my whole life. Then Dad, his voice hollow and defeated, saying he didn't understand what had happened to the daughter he'd raised. I let them all go to voicemail.
I wasn't ready to have the same conversation 4 times to defend my decision to people who had made it clear they would never understand or accept it. Instead, I drove to the hardware store and bought new locks for the house, along with paint samples and a notebook for planning renovations. The house felt different when I walked through it as the owner, rather than just a visitor. The creaky floorboard in the hallway that had always announced when someone was sneaking out after curfew was now my responsibility to fix or preserve as character. The bathroom that had been pink and outdated for as long as I could remember was now mine to renovate however I wanted. The kitchen, where Abuela had taught me to cook, was now the kitchen where I would create my own traditions. I spent the afternoon taking measurements, making notes, and imagining how I wanted to transform the space. Not because I wanted to erase the memories of growing up there, but because I wanted to layer my own adult choices on top of the foundation those memories had provided. I wanted to honor what the house had been, while making it into what I needed it to be now. That evening, I sat on the front porch steps where I'd spent so many summer afternoons reading books and watching the neighborhood change around me. The street looked the same, but everything felt different. I was no longer the daughter who lived here sometimes, the child whose room would always be waiting upstairs. I was the homeowner, the adult, the person responsible for maintenance and taxes and all the practical concerns my family had once insisted I didn't understand. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "We need to talk. This isn't over." Then another from Mom. "Please call me. I don't understand what's happening." And finally one from Carmen. "Dad's in the hospital. Heart palpitations. Mom thinks it's stress from losing the house. Thinks a lot." That last message hit me like a physical blow. I'd known there would be consequences to my decision, had prepared myself for anger and accusations and family drama, but I hadn't considered that the stress might affect Dad's health, that my choice to buy the house might have contributed to a medical emergency. I drove to the hospital, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to prepare myself for whatever I would find there. Dad connected to machines, Mom and Carmen and Marcus united in their anger at me, the whole family gathered around his bedside discussing what a terrible person I'd become. But when I walked into the cardiac unit, I found Dad sitting up in bed, looking tired but alert, while Mom fussed with his blankets and Carmen scrolled through her phone. Marcus wasn't there at all, apparently too busy with work to visit during the crisis he'd been so outraged about. "Celeste," Dad said when he saw me, and his voice was softer than I'd expected, less accusatory. "You came." "Of course I came," I said, approaching his bed cautiously. "How are you feeling?" "Like an old man who's been under too much stress for too long," Dad admitted. "The doctor says it's not a heart attack, just palpitations and high blood pressure. But I need to make some changes, reduce stress, take better care of myself." Mom looked up from the blanket she had been adjusting and fixed me with a stare that could melt steel. "Maybe you could start by explaining to your father why you thought it was appropriate to buy our house at auction instead of helping us save it." "Mom," Dad said gently, "let's not do this here. I'm tired and fighting isn't going to change anything that's already happened." "Not change anything?" Mom's voice rose despite the hospital setting. "She could change it right now. She could sell us the house back for what she paid for it. She could undo this whole terrible mistake." I felt something shift inside me, a clarity that cut through the guilt and confusion I'd been feeling since Carmen's text about Dad's hospitalization. Mom wasn't asking me to be generous or kind. She was asking me to pretend that the last 18 months hadn't happened, that I hadn't planned and saved and worked to make buying that house possible. She wanted me to give up my dream so they could continue living in the reality where I was the supporting character in their story. "I'm not selling the house back," I said quietly but firmly. "I bought it legally at a public auction after none of you were willing or able to help save it. I'm sorry Dad's in the hospital, and I hope the stress in your lives decreases, but I'm not giving up my home to make that happen." "Your home?" Mom repeated incredulously. "That house was our home for 40 years. You lived there for 18 years as our child. It's not your home. It's the home you stole from your family." "I didn't steal it. I bought it."
And it is my home now, legally and practically and emotionally. I'm sorry that hurts you, but I'm not sorry I did it. Carmen looked up from her phone, her eyes red from crying. "Do you understand what you've done to them? Do you see Dad lying in this hospital bed? Do you see Mom crying every night because she doesn't understand how her daughter could betray them like this?" I understand that they're upset, I said. I understand that losing the house was traumatic and stressful, but I also understand that they got themselves into this situation, and none of you were willing to help them get out of it until it was too late. We would have found a way, Carmen insisted. If we'd known the house would sell for so little at auction, we could have pooled our money, figured something out. You didn't give us a chance. I gave you the same chance I gave myself, I replied. The chance to save money, make sacrifices, and prepare for the opportunity when it arose. The difference is that I actually did those things while you all assumed someone else would handle the problem. Dad held up a weak hand, gesturing for us to stop. Ladies, please. This arguing isn't good for any of us, especially not here. He looked at me directly, his eyes clearer than they'd been in years. Celeste, I need you to understand something. Your mother and I are hurt and confused by what you did. We don't understand how you could watch us lose our home and then buy it for yourself. It feels like betrayal because we trusted you. We believed you when you said you couldn't help us financially. I couldn't help you financially, I said. Not the way you wanted me to. Giving you $47,000 would have solved your immediate problem, but left you in the same impossible situation, still unable to afford the mortgage payments, still financially overextended. Within a year or two, you would have been facing foreclosure again. But at least we would have had a chance, Mom said. At least we could have tried to figure it out instead of having our daughter profit from our misfortune. I didn't profit from your misfortune, I said, feeling exhausted by the circular nature of this conversation. I took advantage of an opportunity that became available because of choices you made over many years. The same opportunity that was available to Marcus, to Carmen, to any investor with $45,000 and the willingness to bid at a foreclosure auction. But you're not any investor, Dad said quietly. You're our daughter. That should mean something different. It does mean something different, I agreed. It means that I love that house more than any investor ever could. It means that I'll take care of it properly, preserve the things that matter, honor the memories we made there. It means that instead of being torn down or flipped, it will continue to be a home where a Rivera lives and builds a life. A Rivera who destroyed her own family to get it, Carmen muttered. A Rivera who refused to keep enabling her family's financial irresponsibility, I corrected. The conversation continued for another hour, covering the same ground over and over, with each of us becoming more entrenched in our positions. Finally, I kissed Dad's forehead and told him I hoped he felt better soon. I hugged Mom despite her stiff resistance and told her I loved her, even though we disagreed about this situation. I nodded at Carmen, who refused to make eye contact, and left the hospital feeling drained but not regretful. Over the next few months, the family dynamics settled into a new and uncomfortable pattern. Mom and Dad spoke to me occasionally, stiff conversations about Dad's health and Mom's job, carefully avoiding any mention of the house or my decision to buy it. Marcus called once to tell me I had handled the situation badly and that I should consider family therapy, then didn't contact me again. Carmen blocked my number entirely after sending me a final text message calling me selfish and heartless. But something unexpected happened as the seasons changed and I began making the house truly mine. I started sleeping better than I had in years. The constant low-level anxiety that had characterized my relationship with my family, the feeling that I was always disappointing them or falling short of their expectations, gradually faded away. Without their voices in my head telling me what I should want, what I should prioritize, what I should sacrifice, I began to discover what I actually wanted from my life. I hired contractors to update the kitchen, keeping Abuela's old wooden table, but replacing the appliances and painting the cabinets a warm sage green that made the whole room feel brighter. I converted the basement into a home office where I could manage the coffee shop's business operations and work on the writing projects I had been putting off for years. I planted a garden in the backyard, vegetables and herbs that would have made Abuela proud, along with flowers that existed purely because they were beautiful.
The coffee shop continued to thrive under my ownership. Word had spread about the quality of our products and the warmth of our customer service, and we'd become a gathering place for local writers, students, and business people who appreciated the comfortable atmosphere I'd worked to create. I hired 2 additional employees and began offering evening events like poetry readings and book discussions that brought new energy to the shop and additional revenue to my business. More importantly, I began to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. In my family, I was surrounded by people who knew me but didn't see me, who loved me conditionally based on my usefulness to them. Now, living by myself in the house I dreamed of owning, I felt more connected to my authentic self than I ever experienced while trying to meet other people's expectations. I started dating for the first time in years, going out with people I met through the coffee shop or the writing events I hosted. Nothing serious developed immediately, but I enjoyed the process of getting to know new people without the constant background noise of family drama and obligation. I joined a hiking group, took a pottery class, and began volunteering at the local literacy center, activities that filled my time with joy rather than duty. 6 months after buying the house, I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in the garden on a Saturday morning when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. When I looked up, Dad was walking across the lawn towards me, moving slowly but without the defeated posture he'd had in the hospital. "Hi, mija," he said, stopping a few feet away from where I was kneeling among the tomato plants. "The garden looks good. Abuela would have loved seeing this." "Hi, Dad," I replied, wiping my hands on my jeans and standing up. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he said, and I could see that it was true. His color was improved, his breathing seemed easier, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there during the stressful months before losing the house. "The doctor says my blood pressure is back to normal, and I've been sleeping better since we moved to the apartment." "I'm glad," I said, and meant it completely. "Can we sit on the porch?" Dad asked. "I'd like to talk to you about some things, and it seems like the right place to do it." We settled into the old wooden chairs that had been on that porch for as long as I could remember. Dad was quiet for a few minutes, looking out at the street where he had lived for 40 years, where he had watched his children grow up and his neighbors change, and his own life unfold in ways he never expected. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said finally. "About the house, about money, about family, about the choices your mother and I made over the years. And I've realized some things that I want to share with you."
I waited, not sure what to expect, but hoping it wouldn't be another attempt to convince me to sell the house back to them. "First," Dad continued, "I want to apologize for the way we reacted when you told us you wanted to buy this place. You had a plan, you'd done research, you were serious about it, and we dismissed you like you were still a child with an unrealistic dream. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't accurate. You've always been more responsible with money than any of the rest of us." The apology surprised me with its directness and sincerity. I'd stopped expecting acknowledgement of how they'd treated my dream, had made peace with the fact that they might never understand why their laughter had hurt so much. "Thank you," I said simply. "Second," Dad went on, "I want you to know that losing the house was probably the best thing that could have happened to your mother and me. We'd been living beyond our means for years, borrowing against the future, assuming that everything would work out somehow. The stress of trying to keep up with mortgage payments we couldn't afford was killing me, literally. Now we're in a small apartment with rent we can manage comfortably, and I sleep through the night for the first time in years." This admission was even more surprising than the apology. Dad had always been proud of his home ownership, had often talked about the house as his greatest achievement, his legacy to his children. "I'm glad you're sleeping better," I said. "And third," Dad said, turning to look at me directly, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you did. Not the way you did it, necessarily, because that hurt us, and I wish you'd found a way to communicate better with us about your plans. But the fact that you identified what you wanted, worked systematically to make it possible, and had the courage to act when the opportunity arose,
That takes strength and vision that I didn't give you credit for having. I felt tears starting in my eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. Dad's pride in my accomplishment, his recognition of the planning and sacrifice and risk that had gone into buying the house, meant more to me than I'd realized it would. It was scary, I admitted. Especially the part where I had to choose between helping you save the house and positioning myself to buy it. I knew that choosing to buy it would hurt you, and I hated that. But I also knew that I might never get another chance to own the place that means more to me than anywhere else in the world. Dad nodded slowly. I understand that now, and I think you made the right choice. For you, and maybe for all of us. Your mother and I needed to face the reality of our financial situation instead of continuing to put Band-Aids on problems that required surgery. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light shift across the lawn I was learning to maintain, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood that had shaped both of our lives. "Will you show me what you've done to the place?" Dad asked. "I'd like to see how you're taking care of it." I gave him a tour of the renovations, explaining my choices and my plans for future improvements. He admired the kitchen updates, nodded approvingly at the basement office, and spent a long time looking at the garden where Abuela's herbs were thriving alongside vegetables I'd chosen for my own cooking preferences. "She would have loved this," he said again, touching a basil plant with gentle fingers. "She always said this house needed someone who understood that homes are meant to be lived in, not just maintained." "I remember her saying that," I replied. "I think about her a lot when I'm working in the garden or cooking in the kitchen. It feels like she's still here somehow, approving of the changes I'm making." "She is still here," Dad said. "In the recipes you learned from her, in the way you take care of growing things, in your understanding that a house becomes a home when someone loves it properly." When Dad left that afternoon, something had shifted between us. Not back to the way it was before the foreclosure and auction, but forward to something new and more honest. He hugged me goodbye and said he hoped I'd visit him and Mom soon, that they missed having me in their lives, even though they were still processing their feelings about how everything had happened. Over the following months, Mom and I began talking more regularly. She was slower to accept my decision than Dad had been, but she gradually stopped referring to it as theft or betrayal and started acknowledging it as a choice that had hurt her but hadn't been made to hurt her. Carmen remained distant, sending birthday and holiday cards, but not engaging in real conversation. Marcus occasionally checked in with brief, surface-level calls that suggested he was monitoring the family situation without wanting to become deeply involved in healing it. But the most significant change was in how I understood my own identity within the family structure. For years, I'd defined myself as the reliable one, the helper, the person who absorbed other people's problems and emotions without asking for much in return. Buying the house had forced me to prioritize my own dreams over my family's immediate needs. And in doing so, I'd discovered that I was capable of being selfish in healthy ways, of protecting my own interests while still loving people who didn't understand my choices. The house became the foundation for a life that felt authentically mine, rather than a performance designed to earn approval from people who never valued what I had to offer. I filled it with books I wanted to read, furniture that reflected my taste rather than inherited expectations, and friends who appreciated my company without requiring me to minimize myself to make them comfortable. 2 years after the foreclosure auction, Mrs. Chen retired and moved to Arizona to live near her daughter's family. Before she left, she stopped by the house to see what I'd done with the place and to tell me how proud she was of the business I'd built and the life I'd created for myself. "You know," she said as we sat in the kitchen drinking tea, "when I first offered to sell you the coffee shop, I wasn't sure you were ready for the responsibility. You were so focused on taking care of everyone else that I worried you didn't know how to take care of yourself." I'm not sure I did know how. I had to learn that taking care of myself wasn't the same thing as being selfish, that I could love my family without sacrificing everything I wanted to keep them comfortable. "And now?" Mrs. Chen asked, looking around the kitchen I'd renovated, the garden visible through windows I'd replaced, the life I'd built in the house I had fought to own. Now I know that the best way to love people is to be honest about who you are and what you need, even when that honesty is difficult for them to accept. Mrs. Chen smiled and patted my hand with the same affection she'd shown me when I was a young employee learning to manage the coffee shop. Your grandmother would be very proud of the woman you've become, and very happy to know that her house is being loved by someone who understands what it means to make a place into a home. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, appreciating how it had evolved from the place where I had grown up into the place where I was building my adult life. The walls held the same memories, but they were layered now with new experiences, new traditions, new ways of understanding what family meant and what I owed to the people I loved. I ended up on the front porch, in the same chair where Dad and I had talked honestly for the first time in years, looking out at the street where I'd learned to ride a bike and then later learned to drive a car, and eventually learned that coming home meant more than just returning to a familiar place. It meant returning to yourself, to the person you were meant to be when you stopped trying to be who everyone else needed you to be. The house was mine now, fully and completely mine, in ways that went beyond legal ownership. I'd earned it through years of planning and sacrifice, through the courage to act when the opportunity arose, and through the willingness to prioritize my own dreams even when that disappointed people I loved. It was the foundation for a life that felt authentic and sustainable, a life where I could be generous without being exploited, loving without being diminished, family-oriented without being family-owned. As the sun set behind the trees I'd climbed as a child, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've chosen correctly, that the price you paid for your dreams was worth every sacrifice it required. The house on Maple Street would always be the place where I'd learned what home meant, first as a child who took it for granted, then as an adult who'd fought to make it truly mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.